In the waning days of the tumultuous 18th century, when the French Revolution still cast long shadows across Europe, there was a man known to few, but entwined deeply in the secret currents of power and betrayal. This was the Count de Montgaillard, a figure whose life seemed to drift like a ghost across the stormy seas of history, caught between loyalty and suspicion, between exile and return. When Venice, that city of canals and whispered diplomacy, found itself encircled and threatened by the relentless advance of the French armies, the Count, who held a diplomatic post there, sought desperately to escape the tightening noose. But the city was surrounded. No secrets could slip through its walls. The Count was seized, his papers, his very thoughts inked onto parchment, confiscated. Yet there was something in the Count's frank manner, a certain ease that pleased the young and ambitious Bonaparte. The general treated him with a measure of indulgence, returning most of his documents, save for 3 touching on political intrigue. The Count would flee again, to Switzerland this time, only to cast himself as a victim of oppression, weaving falsehoods that have since misled many. His story ended in tragedy, assassinated by his own servant in 1802, a grim reminder of the perilous life he led, shadowed by suspicion and betrayal. Amid this web of truth and deception, I came to possess a copy of one of the Count's most compelling manuscripts, a record of a conversation held on a cold December evening in 1796, stretching from early dusk until the quiet hours near midnight. The conversation was witnessed by the Abbé Dumontel, and it revealed a world of clandestine meetings, secret missions, and the delicate dance of loyalty and ambition. Some have doubted its authenticity, but the details, the manner in which it was obtained, and the Count's own assurance of its truth in my presence, compel me to share its passages. It is a glimpse into the hidden heart of the counter-revolutionary efforts brewing beneath the surface of a France torn apart. The Count spoke of his escape and flight to England, his return to France, and the perilous journeys that followed, culminating in his arrival at Basel in the summer of 1795. It was there that his path crossed with the Prince de Condé, a man of noble blood but complex character. The prince summoned him to Mulheim, aware of the Count's French connections, and entrusted him with a dangerous task, to open negotiations with General Pichegru, who, despite the watchful eyes of representatives of the Convention, held command at Altkirch. The Count chose his instruments carefully. Fauche Borel, the king's printer at Neufchâtel, a man skilled in the art of subtle persuasion, along with Monsieur Courant, a local ally. They were to pose as foreign merchants, their passports and papers forged to grant them safe passage through hostile lands. On the 13th of August, under the grey skies, and amidst the relentless rain that seemed to wash the earth with sorrow, Fauche and Courant set out for Altkirch. Days passed in tense waiting, their presence noted, but their purpose hidden. Pichegru, a man both wary and shrewd, observed them closely. When he finally spoke, it was with a voice that cut through the downpour. "I am going to Honingen." Fauche seized the moment, intercepting him in a narrow corridor, and learned that the general planned to dine at the chateau of Madame Salomon, his mistress, a place nestled 3 leagues from Honingen. There, amidst the flickering candlelight and the scent of damp earth beyond the walls, Fauche revealed his pretext. He possessed manuscripts of Rousseau, the philosopher of liberty, which he wished to dedicate to the general. Pichegru, skeptical yet intrigued, insisted on reading them first, wary of being associated with ideas he did not share. But beneath this veneer of literary discussion lay the true purpose. Foch hesitated, then spoke of the Prince de Condé's desire to join forces with Pichegru. The general, guarded but perceptive, demanded clarity. "Explain yourself," he urged, his eyes sharp in the dim light. Foch, stumbling yet determined, conveyed the message. The prince wished to unite with him, to forge a bond in the hope of restoring the monarchy. Yet Pichegru found these words vague and insufficient. He insisted on written instructions and arranged to meet again at 6 in the evening, alone, so that no ears but his own might catch the fragile threads of conspiracy. Back in Basel, the Count labored through the night, penning a letter to Pichegru that sought to awaken the general's pride and sense of duty. It spoke of the vast good to be done, of the gratitude the king would bestow, of titles and lands, of wealth and honor beyond imagining. It promised the marshal's baton, the governorship of Alsace, estates and riches, the town of Arbois renamed in his honor, and pensions to secure his family's future. The offers were grand, shimmering like jewels against the dark backdrop of war and uncertainty. The letter urged Pichegru to proclaim the king to his troops, to surrender Huningen, and to join forces with the prince to march upon Paris itself. When Pichegru read these words, he was cautious, but not dismissive. He questioned the authority of the Count de Montgaillard, whose name he did not know. Only when presented with a letter from the Prince de Condé himself, albeit one wrangled from the prince's reluctance and scribbled under duress, did Pichegru accept the truth of the matter. The prince was a man of courage, but little else. His mind was clouded, his will weak, and his entourage filled with mediocrity and worse. It took 9 long hours of persuasion to extract a letter of confirmation from him, a letter he did not wish to write, nor to sign, nor to seal, yet finally did, sealing the fragile trust between these conspirators. Pichegru's response was measured and resolute. He would not act half-heartedly. The plan to proclaim the king without securing the full strength of the army and the support of the Austrians was doomed. He spoke of strategy with the calm certainty of a man who knew the weight of command, who understood the dangers lurking in every shadow. His army was a mixture of loyalty and treachery, and he would separate the two, placing trusted officers in positions of power, isolating those who might betray the cause. His plan was bold: to cross the Rhine, to join forces with the prince and the emperor's army, to reclaim fortresses in the king's name, and to march on Paris with the certainty of overwhelming force. But he knew the soldier's heart, and he knew what it took to win their loyalty: wine and a crown in their hands, a promise of reward and glory that must be fulfilled from the first step on French soil. Yet this grand design was shadowed by the presence of the representatives of the Convention, particularly Merlin de Thionville, whose fierce inquisitorial gaze never wavered. They pressed Pichegru to obey their orders, to besiege Mannheim, to act swiftly, lest suspicion fall upon him. The general balanced on a knife's edge between loyalty and treason, between hope and despair. The Prince de Condé, however, blinded by pride and the desire for sole glory, rejected Pichegru's plan outright. He refused to involve the Austrians, to share the triumph that might be won. Instead, he clung to his original flawed scheme, insisting that Pichegru proclaim the king without crossing the Rhine and surrender Huningen, promising gold and riches to sweeten the bitter pill. No argument could sway the prince's obstinacy. The delicate negotiations hung in the balance, carried by the hands of Courant, who was dispatched to relay the prince's refusal to Pichegru. As these secret exchanges unfolded, I found myself copying the documents by candlelight, the ink flowing slowly across the pages, while Napoleon himself slept, unaware of the plots weaving beneath his very feet. Despite later denials and attempts to erase these truths from memory, I remain convinced of their authenticity. And so, in the quiet hours, as the night deepened and the world seemed to hold its breath, the machinery of revolution and counter-revolution turned inexorably forward. Napoleon had commissioned engravings of his most famed battles, paying in advance for their creation, a testament to his relentless hunger for glory, even as others plotted in the shadows. And so, as night fell, the march continued. The Prince de Condé was deeply affected by the idea of sharing his plan with Wurmser, of intertwining their fates and glory, yet this very thought blinded him to every caution, deaf to every whisper of prudence. Yet it was necessary that the observations of the prince be conveyed to Pichegru, and so Courant was entrusted with this delicate task. I found the document so compelling that while Bonaparte lay asleep, I busied myself in copying it. Despite later denials, repeated and insistent, I have always believed it to be true, the words etched with a clarity that time could not erase. Napoleon, ever hungry for recognition, had commanded plans of his most celebrated battles to be engraved, paying in advance for these immortalizations of his campaigns. But the work progressed too slowly for his restless spirit. One day, in a rare moment of impatience, he chided his geographer, Baclair d'Albe, a man he held in some favor. "Ah, do hurry yourself," he said, "and think all this is only the business of a moment. If you delay further, you will sell nothing. Everything is soon forgotten." Such was the urgency that gripped him, the relentless desire to capture the fleeting moment of triumph before it slipped away into obscurity. It was July then, and the negotiations crawled forward with a sluggishness that betrayed hidden reserves on both sides. Bonaparte was far from willing to sign a peace treaty, his mind fixed on a grander stage, Vienna, after a campaign in Germany, with the armies of the Rhine and the Sambre Meuse at his back. The Directory itself was divided. A minority urged peace on the basis of preliminary terms, while the majority sought more honorable and advantageous conditions. Austria, meanwhile, relying on the turmoil they expected to erupt in France, showed no haste to conclude matters. In this charged atmosphere, Bonaparte drafted a letter to the Emperor of Austria, a letter that spoke of France's moderation, yet warned that, because of endless delays, hope for peace was nearly extinguished. He counseled the emperor not to count on disturbances in France to aid his cause, and doubted that even a victorious campaign would grant him better terms than were currently on offer. This letter, though drafted, was never sent, shared only with the Directory as a proposed dispatch. The Emperor Francis, however, penned his own letter to the General-in-Chief of the Army of Italy, a letter whose arrival would mark a new chapter in this unfolding drama. Bonaparte's heart was set on war. He knew well that the Viennese court was toying with him, their ministers gambling on political upheaval in Paris that might favor the Bourbons. He asked for reinforcements, calling to raise his army from 35,900 men to 60,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry, ready for the field. The weight of this request spoke of his hunger for decisive action. At the end of July, General Desaix arrived, drawn by the recent triumphs of the army of Italy. Their conversations were cautious and measured, with Desaix expressing doubts about the army of the Rhine's support should conflict erupt beyond the mountains. It was in these moments that their friendship blossomed, a bond forged in respect and shared ambition. Desaix, discontented with the conduct of affairs in Germany, had left the army of the Rhine to join Bonaparte's forces in Italy. He was charged with organizing the Egyptian expedition's departure from Civitavecchia, accompanied by his aides-de-camp, Rapp and Savary, men who would later rise to prominence alongside Bonaparte himself. When Desaix assumed temporary command of the Army of England during Bonaparte's absence, the General-in-Chief wrote to the Directory praising him as the most distinguished officer they could have chosen, sentiments he never betrayed. Only Desaix's untimely death would sever this promising alliance, a loss that would echo in Bonaparte's military and political life. The world knew well the role Bonaparte played in the crisis of the 18th Fructidor, his proclamations, his stirring addresses to the army, his famous orders of the day. He spoke often of this at St. Helena, and now I turn to what I knew of this fateful event as it brewed in June. Bonaparte had long watched the fierce struggle between royalists and republicans within France. Reports reached him that royalist sentiment was growing, spreading like a shadow over the land. Generals returning to the army spoke of a spirit of reaction they had encountered in Paris. Private letters urged him to choose a side, to act decisively. He was stung by the boldness of the Republic's enemies. The orators at the Club of Clichy spared no opportunity to wound his pride, their speeches and pamphlets laced with insults, their voices raised against his victories and his conduct in Italy, especially over the dealings with Venice. His service was met with ingratitude, his triumphs with hatred. A pamphlet reached him, one that mocked the judgments of German journals, particularly the Spectator of the North, which he always had translated for me. The comparison between himself and Moreau cut deep, the implication that Moreau was prudent and learned, while Bonaparte was reckless and wild. The term brigands applied to those who fought in La Vendée he recognized as the work of the faction he was preparing to strike down. He was weary of Moreau's savants' war, but what wounded him most was seeing men who sat in the councils of the nation, Frenchmen no less, who were detractors of the national glory, who whispered and plotted against the republic he served. He pressed the Directory to arrest the emigrants, to crush the influence of foreigners, to recall the armies, to silence the journals sold to England, the Quotidienne, the Memorial, the Thé, journals he accused of bloodthirstiness surpassing even Marat's. He even offered to resign if no means could be found to stop assassinations and the influence of Louis XVIII. His resolve to cross the Alps with 25,000 men and march through Lyons to Paris was no secret in the capital. Whispers and debates swirled about the consequences of this new crossing of a Rubicon. On August 17th, Carnot wrote to him, "People attribute to you 1,000 absurd projects, They cannot believe that a man who has performed so many great exploits can be content to live as a private citizen. This was in response to Bonaparte's repeated requests to retire due to ill health, unable, he claimed, to mount his horse, and his yearning for 2 years of rest. Bonaparte rightly believed that the delays and difficulties in the negotiations were rooted in the expectation of a change in France's government, a shift that would favor Austria's cause. He again urged the arrest of the emigrants, the suppression of royalist presses, and the destruction of the Clichy Club, a gathering held at General Desaix's residence on Rue de Clichy. Aubry, one of its staunchest supporters, was a declared enemy of the revolutionary cause, and his role in provoking Bonaparte's dismissal in 1795 had kindled an implacable hatred in the general's heart. He despised the Directory, accusing it of weakness, indecision, cowardice, wastefulness, errors, and a stubborn persistence in degrading the nation's glory. The Directory's own failings were starkly evident. When first installed in the Luxembourg in October 1795, their chamber was nearly bare. A small broken table, a few rush-bottomed chairs, a writing desk, and dim firewood borrowed from the porter. Yet, in this humble setting, they resolved to confront the abyss into which France had plunged, to either save the nation or perish trying. Their first act was drafted on a mere sheet of letter paper and sent immediately to the legislative bodies. Yet, the spectacle of their power was often farcical. The Comte de la Valette described them as 5 kings garbed in the robes of Francis I, their faces and attire a curious blend of the old and the ridiculous. Talleyrand, in wine-coloured pantaloons, played the ambassador to the Grand Duke of Tuscany, while the French dined below. Musicians and actresses roared patriotic cantatas, and beautiful young women, their arms and bosoms bare, celebrated the majesty of the Republic. But beneath this mask, thousands wept for banished fathers, 48 departments lost their representatives, and 40 editors were forced into exile. What then was this Republic and liberty? The question lingered, heavy and unresolved. Bonaparte knew the Clichy party sought his dismissal and arrest. He was told Dumoulin was among his most determined enemies, and that the royalists were on the verge of triumph. Before choosing a side, Bonaparte thought first of himself. He did not yet believe he had achieved enough to seize power outright. Instead, he joined the party supported by public opinion, determined to defend the Directory, seeing in it a guardian of his future fortunes, a power that kept a place for him until his return. The turmoil in Paris stirred unrest within the army. Even the simple use of the word monsieur sparked quarrels and bloodshed. General Augereau, whose division was caught in these conflicts, issued an order of the day, declaring that any soldier who used monsieur, either in speech or writing, would be stripped of rank and barred from serving in the Republican armies. This order was read aloud at the head of every company, a stark measure in a land rent by political strife. For Bonaparte, peace meant the end of his military career. Rest and inactivity were unbearable to him. He longed to engage fully in the Republic's civil affairs, yearning to become one of the 5 directors. He believed that once among them, he would stand alone, the single master of his fate. Had this wish been fulfilled, the Egyptian expedition might never have taken place, and the imperial crown might have rested on his head far sooner. Intrigues in Paris sought to secure for him a dispensation on account of his age. He was but 28, yet hoped to supersede one of the directors soon to leave office. But the directors required appointees to be at least 40 years old. His brothers and their allies worked tirelessly to advance this plan, though it was never officially proposed, deemed too radical, and a premature violation of the constitution of the year 3, a constitution that would soon be broken in other ways. The Directory was far from eager to welcome Bonaparte among them. Both parties masked their true feelings with friendly words, while harboring deep mutual hatred. Yet the Directory appealed to Bonaparte for support, which he granted, though his actions would later reveal that his defense of the Constitution was but a pretext. He upheld it only so long as it served his influence over the Directory. I know well that had the Clichy party gained power, he was prepared to cross the Alps, rally the friends of the Republic at Lyons, and march upon Paris. In the memorial of St. Helena, it is said that the triumph of the majority of the councils was his desire and hope, a belief supported by the fact that at the climax of the struggle between factions. And so, as night fell, the march continued. In the restless days that preceded the dramatic upheaval of the 18th Fructidor, the air was thick with tension and unspoken plans. Napoleon, ever watchful of the shifting tides of power, knew well that should the royalist Clichy party rise triumphant, his own influence over the Directory would slip away like sand through fingers. He harbored a quiet but resolute determination, a plan etched firmly in his mind. If the Clichyans prevailed, he would lead his army across the towering Alps, calling together all loyal friends of the Republic in Lyons, and from there he would march upon Paris itself. This was not merely ambition, it was a desperate grasp at preserving the fragile Republic he had sworn to defend. The events of the 18th Fructidor unfolded like a shadowed drama, veiling their true nature beneath layers of official statements and whispered rumors. In his later reflections at St. Helena, Napoleon claimed that it was the majority in the councils he wished to see victorious, yet he spoke of a secret resolution by the Directory seeking 3 million francs to support their assault, a resolution that, he said, never reached his hands, and so he withheld the funds. But reality paints a different picture. There was no secret appeal. It was Napoleon himself who offered the money, who sent the resolute General Augereau forth, and who ardently desired the triumph of the directorial majority. His memory, clouded by the passage of time and the weight of exile, served him poorly in this recounting. The truth, preserved in letters and dispatches, reveals a man deeply invested in the fate of the Republic, ready to back the Directory against the royalist threat. On the 17th of July, with the summer heat lingering, Napoleon summoned Augereau from Vicenza by a swift and secret courier, confiding in him the weighty plans ahead. The days that followed were marked by a delicate dance of trust and suspicion. When Botto, a trusted agent of Barras, arrived at Passeriano after the coup, he spoke of funds to be sent once the true state of affairs was known. But this too was a distortion, a fog of half-truths and misdirection. Napoleon's real intent was clear: to back the Directory's majority with unwavering support and to thwart the rising royalist faction, which, though gaining strength, could not sway him from his republican convictions. To maintain a steady line of communication, he dispatched his aide-de-camp, Lavalette, a man of gentle manners and moderate views, to Paris with secret instructions and a cipher to ensure their messages remained veiled from prying eyes. Lavalette's arrival was soon followed by Augereau himself, who, under the pretense of attending to private matters, was sent explicitly to bolster the brewing revolution against the Clichy party. Napoleon chose Augereau for his fierce republican zeal and boldness, yet also for his lack of political cunning. He was a tool, not a rival, and thus could be trusted to act without ambition for himself. Bernadotte, a more cautious figure, was later sent on a similar mission, carrying flags captured at Rivoli as a pretext, though he played a lesser role in the unfolding drama. The 18th Fructidor marked a pivotal moment, a violent, swift stroke that dissolved the legislative body and crushed the royalist minority. Augereau's own words, penned in the heat of those days, speak of midnight orders, bridges seized, and council halls encircled by cannon fire, as deputies were arrested and spirited away under the cold gaze of soldiers. Paris, though shaken, held its breath and then exhaled in a surprising calm, the streets ringing with cries of "Vive la République," as the shadow of royalist threat was cast back into hiding. Yet even in triumph, the seeds of discord were sown. Augereau, proud and vain, yearned for greater reward, hoping to ascend to the Directory himself, while Napoleon watched with a knowing smile, aware of the fragile egos and shifting loyalties that danced around him. Letters flew between the commanders and the Directory, revealing unease and suspicion, the cautious steps of a government struggling to steady itself after the storm. Bernadotte's report spoke of a populace initially indifferent, but soon swept by a wave of republican fervor, while Napoleon's own proclamations to the army and the southern departments echoed with resolve, ready to march swiftly should any stirrings of unrest arise. Amid this turbulent backdrop, Napoleon's thoughts turned to his brother Joseph, whose position in the Council of 500 had been contested by the Clichyans. With their fall, this obstacle vanished, but Napoleon soon saw the new ruling faction slip into excess, threatening once more the Republic's fragile balance. The Directory, uneasy with his criticism, sought to counterbalance his influence by elevating Augereau, who, intoxicated by his own brief taste of power, fancied himself a rival. Yet the General-in-Chief, ever astute, merely laughed behind the scenes and tendered his resignation, a calculated move to be begged to stay. In letters written with a steady hand and clear mind, Napoleon expressed his hopes and cautions, urging moderation, wisdom, and unity to secure the Republic's future. He lamented the government's fickle nature, wary of being cast aside as Pichegru had been. The correspondence reveals a man both deeply involved and strategically distant, navigating the treacherous waters of revolutionary politics with a blend of passion and prudence. As the days lengthened into autumn, and the echoes of Fructidor's triumph still resonated, the stage was set for new challenges. The Republic, battered yet unbroken, awaited the next act in its unfolding drama, with Napoleon poised at its center, a commander of armies and of destinies. And so, as night fell, the march continued. On the 25th, a day steeped in quiet anxiety, the air at Passeriano was thick with unease, a shadow cast over the events that had unfolded on the 18th. It was on this day that a messenger arrived, bearing with him a circular from General Augereau, addressed to all the generals of division, and alongside it a letter of credit from the Minister of War to the Commissary General, granting him authority to draw whatever sums he might require for his journey. Such formalities, so carefully wrapped in official seal and paper, hinted at a deeper, more troubling undercurrent. It was clear from these tokens and the manner in which they were delivered that the government's attitude toward Bonaparte mirrored the cold suspicion once cast upon Pichegru after the Vendémiaire uprising. The weight of this realization was not lost on him. In a letter that bore the quiet dignity of a man wounded yet unbowed, Bonaparte entreated that his resignation be accepted, that another be appointed in his stead. No power on earth, he declared, could compel him to continue in service after this grievous mark of ingratitude, a blow that pierced deeper than any enemy's sword. His health, already considerably impaired by the relentless demands of war and command, called out for rest and tranquility. But it was not only his body that sought respite. His mind, burdened by the heavy yoke of power and suspicion, yearned to rejoin the common fold of citizens. He spoke with the quiet pride of one who had wielded great authority, always for the advantage of his country, and who now found his reward not in the fickle favor of men, but in the steadfast judgment of his own conscience and the eyes of posterity. With the country finally at peace, free from the immediate dangers that had once threatened it, he believed it was no longer necessary for him to remain at the helm. Yet he vowed, with a solemnity that echoed through the corridors of history, that should danger arise again, he would be found foremost among the defenders of liberty and the Constitution of the year 3. The Directory, mindful of the unease his letter revealed, and troubled by the report brought by Botto of his mission's failure to dispel all suspicions, penned a letter on the 30th Vendémiaire. They sought to soothe the troubled waters, to assure Bonaparte that the mysterious letter to the Paymaster General, carried by an aide-de-camp unknown to them, was an error, an administrative blunder rather than a calculated slight. They praised his vigilance in intercepting misrepresentations sent to the army of Italy, and even suggested that he might transmit the most notable of these to the Minister of Police, a task both ignoble and burdensome for a conqueror such as himself. Yet they acknowledged his insight into the dangers of military government, agreeing with his enlightened and ardent defense of the Republic. Nothing, they wrote, is wiser than the maxim, sedant arma togae, let arms yield to the toga for the maintenance of republics. Their words, slow and measured, carried the weight of uneasy respect. Amidst these tense exchanges, General Clark was dispatched to treat for peace as second plenipotentiary. Bonaparte, however, harbored a deep suspicion of Clark, believing from the moment of his arrival that he was no mere negotiator, but a spy, charged with watching him, perhaps even arresting him should the opportunity arise without danger. This suspicion, though never confirmed by any direct evidence, clouded their interactions. Clark never pressed questions, never betrayed his supposed secret mission by a word or glance. If he was indeed a spy, he played his part with such subtlety that no trace remained. Bonaparte, though wary, bore him no grudge, even extending kindness by seeking an official post for him. Such generosity was not uncommon in a man whose heart was as complex as the times he navigated. Yet, the shadows of frustration lengthened. The tangled web of peace negotiations, the political storms at Paris, and the personal vexations stirred by his sister's marriage, all these weighed heavily upon him. A letter from her arrived at this delicate moment, reviving old wounds and stoking his anger anew. It was a letter that bore not only familial affection, but the quiet hope of reconciliation, penned in the hand of Lucien Bonaparte, but speaking with the voice of Christine Bonaparte, whose union had caused such displeasure. She wrote softly, pleading for him to stand godfather to her unborn child, reminding him of the bonds of blood and love that tied them beyond the tempests of politics and war. And so, as the days unfolded, the negotiations with Austria took on a new urgency. Bonaparte, settled at Passeriano for nearly a month, received a letter from the Emperor of Austria himself. The words, written with the measured dignity of a monarch, spoke of pain and surprise at the faltering progress of peace, of a desire to bring tranquility to a Europe long ravaged by conflict. The Emperor promised faithfulness to his engagements, yet demanded reciprocity from Bonaparte, urging a frank and sincere explanation to overcome the obstacles that lay in their path. To this end, he sent Count de Montgaillard, a man imbued with his utmost confidence and vested with ample powers to conclude the negotiation. The letter carried the weight of hope and warning alike, a reminder that the fate of thousands rested upon the decisions made in quiet chambers far from the roar of battle. Bonaparte, ever clear-eyed, understood the limitations of the plenipotentiaries who had come before, Gallo and Meervelt, lacking the full authority to bind their sovereign. He sensed the growing impatience of the Austrian cabinet, which welcomed the approach of autumn's chill, pressing harder on their demands, Venice and the line of the Adige in exchange for Mayence and the Rhine's boundary. The tension between these irreconcilable claims gnawed at the fragile thread of peace. Before the upheaval of the 18th Fructidor, the Emperor of Austria had hoped that the tremors shaking Paris might weaken France and strengthen the European cause. The Austrian negotiators, emboldened, raised their demands, sending notes and ultimatums that seemed more a game of delay than earnest diplomacy. Bonaparte's own plans, penned with resolute clarity, laid out the terms he deemed just. The Emperor to hold Italy as far as the Adda, the King of Sardinia to the same boundary, the Genoese Republic to be restored with certain conditions, and the Grand Duke of Tuscany and Duke of Parma reinstated to their rightful places. The 18th Fructidor, a political tempest in Paris, shifted the balance. Bonaparte emerged more powerful, Austria less assured. Venice remained the crux of contention. Austria's desire for the Adige line and Venice itself clashing with the Directory's insistence on Mantua's addition to the Italian Republic. The impasse grew so dire that the Directory, in a letter to Bonaparte, declared that the resumption of hostilities was preferable to the agonizing uncertainty that was tearing France apart. They called for the armies of the Rhine to take the field once more, viewing the peace Bonaparte sought as a betrayal of their cause. Yet Bonaparte, ever the strategist, saw beyond the immediate strife. When the Venetian insurrection erupted, he grasped its potential as a lever for peace. He understood that for the negotiation to reach its end, Venice and the lands beyond the Adige must fall under Habsburg control. He warned the Directory that hostilities could not begin advantageously before the following March, but if objections to ceding Venice persisted, war would surely resume in October. Preparations for such a campaign would require readiness on the Rhine, as the army of Italy, though formidable, was not yet strong enough for grand operations against the Archduke Charles. In the thickening gloom of late September, Botto, secretary to Barras, arrived at Passeriano, dispatched by the Directory. Bonaparte's suspicion flared anew. He believed Botto to be yet another spy, sent to watch his every move. He received the man with cool reserve, wary of the eyes that might be hidden behind polite words. Yet, contrary to some tales that would later be spun, Bonaparte never entertained the thought of ordering Botot's execution. Such stories, whispered and repeated, were but shadows cast by imagination's flickering light. And so, as night fell, the march continued. In the waning days of a restless September, the air hung heavy with uncertainty, and the fragile threads of peace wavered perilously. The question of whether war would resume was no longer distant speculation, but a pressing shadow, darkening the horizon of all who watched. It was in this tense atmosphere that Botot arrived at Passeriano, a man sent by the Directory, carrying with him the weight of suspicion and the silent watchfulness of a government wary of the man who had risen so swiftly and so powerfully. Bonaparte, sharp and wary as ever, met Botto with coolness, his instincts whispering that this visitor was more than a mere messenger, that he was a spy, a shadow sent to observe and judge. Yet, despite the tension, the harshest tales told by others, such as Sir Walter Scott's claim that Botot was ordered shot, were not true. No such violent command passed Bonaparte's lips, and the supposed reproach for failing to send money to the Directory was equally unfounded. Instead, Bonaparte chose to reveal the true spirit that gripped his headquarters, laying bare his frustrations and his fiery discontent. In the presence of Botot, before a gathering of 20 or 30, he suddenly offered his resignation, a gesture he had made many times before, but now delivered with a loud and impassioned voice that echoed through the room. At table, he did not hold back, voicing his grievances with a fierce candor that startled many. The air was thick with the taste of bitter ingratitude, and Bonaparte's words cut sharply through the polite veneer of diplomatic conversation. His anger found a particular target in the stubborn refusal of the Directory to remove a certain name from the list of emigrants, a name that, to Bonaparte's growing vexation, remained obstinately fixed despite repeated appeals. This was no small matter. It was a symbol of mistrust and a source of deep personal affront. One day, before a crowd of 40, including diplomats such as Gallo, Cobentzel, and Meervelt, Bonaparte's voice rang out, loud and clear, as he turned to Botot with a challenge. "Look, I pray you, at Bourrienne's case," he said. "He holds my utmost confidence. He alone manages the details of our negotiations under my orders. Yet your Directory refuses to strike his name off the list. It is not only inconceivable but foolish, for he holds all my secrets, knows my ultimatum, and could, with a single word, make a fortune while laughing at your obstinacy. Ask Monsieur de Gallo if this is not true." Botto, caught in the sudden storm of accusation, sought to reply, but the murmurs of agreement and disapproval around him stilled his voice. Not long before, the Marquis de Gallo had spoken quietly with me in the park of Passeriano. his words heavy with the weight of political calculation. He told me of the Directory's firm stance, not willing to erase my name from that dreaded list, despite the dangers it posed. "We do not desire war," he said gently. "We seek peace, but it must be honorable. Venice offers a vast territory for partition, enough for all. But the current offers are unsatisfactory. We need to know Bonaparte's ultimatum," he went on, revealing an offer that seemed almost generous. An estate in Bohemia, with title, residence, and an income of 90,000 florins. I cut him short, my conscience and duty clear. Such a proposal I could not accept. The conversation ended there, the silence heavy between us. I made sure that Bonaparte knew of this exchange. He was unsurprised by my refusal, yet from the words of Monsieur de Gallo, and especially the offer made, he drew the firm conclusion that Austria wished to avoid war and desired peace. Yet, even as these diplomatic dances played out, suspicion and distrust gnawed relentlessly at Bonaparte's mind. Late one evening, after the day's weariness had settled, Botot appeared at my door, feigning surprise at the stubborn presence of my name on the emigrants' list. He asked me to write a note, to plead once more for removal. I declined, weary of repeated petitions, and resolved to await the decision in silence, in a state of quiet inaction. Bonaparte himself found it incomprehensible that the Directory should take offence at his candid view of the events of the 18th Fructidor, events that, without his decisive action, might have been lost. He penned a dispatch, a letter that spoke of his failing health and spirits, his need for rest, the fatigue of endless riding, and yet, despite all, his unwavering devotion to the prosperity and liberty of France. But these words, tender as they seemed, held no truth. The Directory saw through the veil and refused to accept his resignation, their refusal wrapped in words flattering yet firm. Botot, carrying the Directory's hopes, proposed a sweeping revolution across Italy. Bonaparte, ever precise, asked if the entire peninsula was included, but Botot's vague hesitation betrayed uncertainty. Before any such grand scheme could take root, peace was signed, and the dangerous idea faded into the shadows. After returning to Paris, Botot wrote to Bonaparte, lamenting the cruel suspicions that had followed him even to the gates of the Directory, but claiming that admiration and affection for Bonaparte nonetheless prevailed. These assurances, expected though they were, did little to soften Bonaparte's contempt for the government's leaders. He saw through the pretense, sensing envy and mistrust where they professed loyalty. Botot's letter spoke of republican docility, of armies to be united, of officers recalled or sent to join Bonaparte, of treaties ratified, and of names finally erased from lists. Yet, in truth, the erasure of my name was delayed for months, only coming on the 11th of November, long after Bonaparte's repeated demands. As the negotiations neared their close, Bonaparte's frustration boiled over. He offered his resignation again and again, begging for a successor to be named. His unease grew from the belief that the Directory had uncovered his true motives, that his decisive role in the 18th Fructidor was driven not by patriotism alone, but by personal ambition. Despite written assurances of gratitude, spies shadowed his every move, seeking to unravel his thoughts and plans through those close to him. Friends in Paris sent words of caution, urging the peace that only he could secure, warning against the perils of renewed war with its uncertain fortunes. His own actions, his cautious halt at Rastatt, his avoidance of the Congress, his decision to take his army into exile to seek new conquests, sprang from this deep-seated fear of betrayal and ruin. He remembered Lavalette's words about his conversation with Lequy, and every sight and sound around him seemed to confirm the grim suspicion that he was being watched, and that his downfall was being plotted. Then came the early frost, a cruel and sudden herald of winter. On the morning of the 13th of October, I opened my window to a world transformed. The mountains, once green and alive, now cloaked in cold white snow. The previous night had been clear and beautiful, and the autumn had promised a gentle, lingering farewell. I found Bonaparte as usual at 7 in the morning, and I told him what I saw. At first, he doubted, then leapt to the window to see for himself. The evidence was undeniable. "What?" he exclaimed, a note of disbelief in his voice. "Before the middle of October? What a country is this? Well, we must make peace." As he dressed in haste, I read the journals aloud, though his mind seemed elsewhere. In the quiet of his study, surrounded by maps and reports, he carefully reviewed the strength of his forces. "Nearly 80,000 men," he said. "I feed and pay them, but only 60,000 can fight on the day of battle. I shall win, but afterward 20,000 will be lost, killed, wounded, or prisoners. And how can I face all the Austrian forces moving to defend Vienna? The armies of the Rhine may come in a month, if at all, and by then the roads will be buried in snow." His decision settled like a stone in the chill air. "I will make peace. Venice shall pay for the cost of the war and the boundary of the Rhine. Let the Directory and the lawyers say what they will." He wrote to the Directory, his words clear and firm. "The summits of the hills are covered with snow. I cannot, due to the terms agreed upon for the recommencement of hostilities, begin before 25 days, and by that time we shall be overwhelmed with snow. 14 years later, in a harsher winter and in a colder land, this early snow would prove fatally decisive, had he only then possessed equal foresight." The treaty that followed, the Treaty of Campo Formio, was a peace forged at the expense of the ancient Republic of Venice, a state that had little part in the quarrel, and seemed drawn into the conflict only by the relentless tides of circumstance. Venice was carved apart, its territories divided like a prize among the victors. Some lands passed to the Cisalpine Republic, but now lie in Austrian hands. Others, including the proud city itself, were awarded to Austria as compensation for provinces ceded to France. Austria reclaimed Lombardy and its additions, and Belgium fell under the House of Orange. France gained Corfu and some Ionian islands, though these too would later slip from her grasp, passing to England and then to Greece. It was a great spoliation, a quiet upheaval that saw an ancient state dissolve without the roar of cannon or the clatter of arms. The provinces, once proud and free, now bowed beneath Austrian rule. France held no ground in these lands it had fought so fiercely to claim. And so, in a bitter irony, the House of Habsburg was strengthened by a war that had brought it great disaster. Austria, it seemed, had long been skilled in extending its dominion not only through the sword, but through other means, as the old distich of Matthias Corvinus once noted, "Glad Austria wins by Hymen's silken chain, what other states by doubtful battle gain." The Directory, however, was far from pleased with the terms of Campo Formio. They resisted ratification, writing to Bonaparte days before the signature, refusing to consent to the cession of Venice, Friuli, Padua, and the lands along the Adige. That would not be peace, they declared, but a postponement of war. We would be seen as the defeated party, and worse still, we would abandon Venice, a city Bonaparte himself held worthy of freedom. France should never consent to see Italy given over to Austria. The Directory would rather risk war than alter a single word of its ultimatum, which was already too favourable to Austria. But Bonaparte, driven by his own vision, disregarded these protests. Rumours swirled that the Emperor of Austria had offered vast sums of money and even a principality to secure favourable terms, but no evidence ever surfaced to support such claims. Bonaparte's character was too proud, his ambition too pure to trade his glory as conqueror and peacemaker for private gain. The Austrian plenipotentiaries, who respected him deeply, would never have dared to propose such a degrading bargain. The tale of a porcelain tray shattered in anger at Passeriano was equally unfounded. Our manners were not so coarse. Instead, customary gifts were exchanged, and the Emperor of Austria presented Bonaparte with 6 magnificent white horses, a symbol of honor and esteem. Bonaparte's journey back to Milan carried him through Graz, Laybach, Thrust, Mestre, Verona, and Mantua, a passage marked by the slow turning of seasons and the weight of history. At this time, he remained a man shaped by the currents of his age, a man who dreamed of representative governments and often spoke of leaving to the world the legacy of an era defined by such ideals. I should like, he told me, the era of representative governments to be dated from my time. His actions in Italy, his proclamations, bore witness to this ambition, though the full truth of his convictions was complex and layered, as all great men are. And so, as the autumn winds whispered through the trees and the first snows settled on the distant peaks, the wheels of history turned inexorably onward, carrying with them the hopes and fears of men caught between glory and ruin. And so, as night fell, the march continued. On several occasions, the Emperor of Austria took the moment to present General Bonaparte with 6 magnificent white horses, gifts that symbolized honor and recognition amidst the shifting tides of power. Bonaparte's journey back to Milan traced a path through Graz, Laybach, Thrust, Mestre, Verona, and Mantua, towns and cities marked by the echoes of war and the stirring promise of change. At this time, the young general was still deeply influenced by the spirit of his age, a time when ideas of representative governments stirred the hearts and minds of many. He often confided, I should like the era of representative governments to be dated from my time, words that spoke of grand ambitions, of shaping a new order, not just for France, but for all Europe. Yet beneath this lofty idealism, there was a hunger, an ambition not purely for the good of mankind, but for the glory and power that could be wielded by one who commanded armies and shaped destinies. Later, he would say, I should like to be the head of the most ancient of the dynasties of Europe, revealing the transformation from revolutionary soldier to imperial sovereign. What a gulf lay between the Bonaparte who had authored the Souper de Beaucaire, who had crushed royalist plots at Toulon, who had stood resolute in the streets during the 13th Vendémiaire, and who had helped found the republics in Italy, the fruits of his immortal victories, and the Bonaparte who, by 1800, was first consul, by 1802 consul for life, and by 1804 Napoleon, Emperor of the French, crowned King of Italy the following year. The day of the 18th Fructidor had played a quiet but decisive role in shaping peace at Campo Formio. The Directory, previously inclined toward continued conflict, had been shaken by the coup d'etat and saw the pressing need to appease a weary and discontented nation by securing peace. Meanwhile, the Austrian court, having witnessed the collapse of royalist conspiracies at home, recognized the necessity of coming to terms with the French Republic. Despite the defeats it had suffered, Austria still clung to its influence in Italy, and the treaty offered a fragile balance between conquest and diplomacy. The Italian campaign had been rich not only in the glory of arms, but in the deeper currents of political change. The victories and subsequent peace began to cast a new moral light over France, softening the fierce fires of republicanism that had burned so hotly in previous years. Bonaparte, negotiating with princes and ministers on equal footing, yet always carrying the undeniable weight of his military genius and triumphs, was gradually teaching the royal courts of Europe to tolerate, even respect, the Republic. No longer were kings and republics destined enemies by nature. A new order was quietly taking shape in the shadows of the battlefield. With this in mind, the General-in-Chief's departure from Milan and his expected arrival in Paris stirred great curiosity and anticipation. The fragile Directory, weakened and uncertain, was ready to accept the presence of the conqueror of Italy in the capital, perhaps sensing the tides of change that he represented. It was to take up the role of head of the French legation at the Congress of Rastatt that Bonaparte left Milan on the 17th of November. But before departing, he sent the Directory a powerful symbol, one of those monuments whose inscriptions often stretch the bounds of truth, but in this case told the simple, undeniable story of his campaign. This was the flag of the Army of Italy, entrusted to General Joubert to present to the executive government. On one side, the words, "To the Army of Italy, the grateful country," bore witness to gratitude and honor. On the other, a litany of battles fought, cities taken, and trophies won. 150,000 prisoners, 170 standards captured, hundreds of artillery pieces seized, fleets of ships subdued, and armistices signed with kings and dukes alike. It was a scroll of conquest and diplomacy, embroidered with the names of cities now free: Bologna, Ferrara, Modena, Massa Carrara, and many more, places where the word liberty echoed from the Alps down to the Apennines. The flag also bore the names of masterpieces sent to Paris, works by Michelangelo, Titian, Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci, reminders that the spoils of war were not only men and territory, but the very treasures of culture and history. This flag was destined to hang in the hall of the public sittings of the Directory, a banner of military glory and political triumph, a testament to the sweeping changes wrought by Bonaparte's hand. Most of the Italian cities greeted their conqueror as a liberator. The word liberty held a magic that softened the harsh realities of occupation and battle, transforming fear into hope. At Mantua, Bonaparte took up residence in the palace of ancient dukes, a place heavy with the weight of history. He promised the local authorities that their department would become one of the most extensive, urging them to organize a local militia swiftly and to begin the ambitious plans for navigation of the Mincio River, a lifeline between Mantua and Peschiera, conceived by the mathematician Mari. He lingered 2 days in Mantua, and on the morning after his arrival, the city held a solemn military funeral for General Hoche, who had recently died. It was a moment heavy with grief and honor, the soldiers' drums rolling softly through the cold air, the echo of loss mingling with the pride of victory. Bonaparte also moved to hasten the erection of a monument to Virgil, the ancient poet whose words had once sung the landscapes of Italy. In one day, the general paid homage both to the modern laurels of war and the timeless laurels of poetry, bridging the living present with the distant past. A witness to this scene, seeing Bonaparte for the first time, wrote a letter back to Paris filled with quiet wonder. He described the man as small, thin, pale, with an air of fatigue, not illness, but the weariness of relentless thought and burdened purpose. His gaze was distant, abstracted, as if his mind wandered far beyond the conversations around him. There was a sharp intelligence in his face, a habitual meditation that concealed the fierce activity within. The observer sensed that in that bold, restless mind, daring designs were brewing, destined to shape the fate of Europe itself. Though this letter was penned before Bonaparte's name had struck fear across the continent, it captured the essence of a man on the cusp of greatness, a figure whose path was only beginning to unfold. As if drawn by the echoes of history, Bonaparte made a pilgrimage to the field of Morat in Switzerland, where in 1476 Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, had met his doom beneath the valor of the Helvetians. There, amidst the quiet plains and ancient stones, the general stood contemplating the shadows of past battles. His carriage broke down near Mordaunt, compelling him and his small retinue to continue on foot, the crunch of their boots on the earth mingling with the distant whisper of history. Near the ossuary, Bonaparte listened intently as an officer recounted how the Swiss, hidden by the woods and descending from the mountains, had turned the Burgundian army and sent it fleeing. "What was the force of that army?" he asked quietly. 60,000 men, came the reply. 60,000 men, Bonaparte exclaimed, eyes narrowing. They ought to have completely covered these mountains. Lannes, one of his officers, ventured softly. The French fight better now. Bonaparte interrupted with a wry smile. At that time, the Burgundians were not Frenchmen. His journey through Switzerland was more than a passage. It was a reflection, a quiet moment of connection between the past and the present, between the dreams of conquest and the reality of history. His presence there, amid the silent fields where armies had clashed centuries before, was itself a symbol of the relentless march of time and the unfolding of new destinies. And so, as night fell, the march continued.